To start with the legal basis for accountability, the four Geneva Conventions of 1949, along with their additional protocols, they form the backbone of the international humanitarian law, and they impose a non-derogable obligation on occupying powers, including Israel, to protect civilians, prohibit collective punishment, and allow humanitarian relief. However, since October 7th of 2023, we have been seeing indiscriminate bombardment. We have been seeing starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. We've been seeing systematic destruction of hospitals, schools, and UN facilities. We've been also seeing a forced displacement of over 1.4 million people. And of course, these crimes or these actions are grave breaches under the Fourth Geneva Convention, and they constitute war crimes, and if not, crimes against humanity. And accordingly, international organizations have a legal duty, not just a political option, to intervene meaningfully. Now, let's generally take a look of what the current role of international organizations is. We do have the UN Human Rights Council establishing the Commission of Inquiry into the Gaza hostilities. We did see the International Criminal Court affirming that its ongoing Palestine investigation covers recent events. We have seen several UN special rapporteurs issuing urgent alerts of a genocide. However, we have three hurdles or three obstacles towards any of the efforts of the international organizations. Number one, we've been seeing massive political pressure. We did see in early 2024 countries, most notably the United States, the UK, Canada, Germany, Australia, among others, cutting or suspending funding to Palestinian international organizations assisting Palestine, most notably the UNRWA. Based on unproven allegations regarding the staff conduct, they even have targeted the UN Commission of Inquiry. Another obstacle we have is the vetoes at the UN Security Council. From October 2023 to April 2025, we have seen at least 5 ceasefire and accountability resolutions that were vetoed, primarily by the United States and sometimes the United Kingdom, preventing any binding action. The third obstacle we have is selective enforcement. We didn't see any major Western power impose sanctions on Israeli officials despite an abundance of evidence on serious violations, unlike swift actions being taken in other conflicts like the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, for example. So now let's systematically assess how each organization was meant to act under international law and what actually happened. So taking the United Nations, for example, the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, the intended role under international humanitarian law is to investigate violations of international humanitarian law, to mobilize international consensus to protect civilians and ensure legal accountability, and to even convene high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions under Common Article 1 to address systematic violations. However, we have seen the UN General Assembly passing multiple resolutions, but it lacked any binding enforcement mechanisms. In April 2024, we've seen the General Assembly proposing a conference of high contracting parties to the Geneva Conventions, which could have created a rare collective platform to hold Israel accountable under international humanitarian law. However, the conference was cancelled in March 2025. We've also seen the Human Rights Council establishing fact-finding missions, but these missions were reportedly obstructed by a lack of access to the Israeli territory or the Gazan territory, and along with the withdrawal of funding and even refusal of cooperation from Israel and its allies. Taking the International Criminal Court as another example, the intended role under international humanitarian law is to investigate and prosecute individuals responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, with the current situation, we've seen Palestine accede to the Rome Statute in 2015, granting the ICC procedures following the escalation after October 7, 2023, we've seen the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan prioritizing investigations into the alleged crimes. However, although there was an arrest warrant against the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the defense minister, it hasn't been implemented because there is no enforcement mechanism. We've seen charges, they've been charged with starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. They've been charged with intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population. We've seen persecution. We've seen other inhumane acts. However, Israel rejected the ICC's jurisdiction, arguing that it's not a party to the Rome Statute, and this mounted a formal challenge. In April 2025, the ICC Appeals Chamber also ordered a reconsideration of Israel's jurisdictional objections, indicating that the procedural shortcomings in how they were initially dismissed. But despite the issue of the warrants, enforcement remains elusive. Israel refused cooperation, and no major Western states have pledged to assist in executing the warrants. And of course, political threats and funding pressures have also been levied against the ICC. We've seen Trump state that, or even threaten the ICC of issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu. So the key issue here is that without international cooperation, arrest warrants risk remaining a symbolic act rather than a practical tool for justice. Moving on to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. Its intended role under international humanitarian law is to resolve interstate disputes and issue advisory opinions on legal violations. With the recent case, we have seen in January 2024, South Africa filing a legal case against Israel under the Genocide Convention. A lot of countries joined it, including Egypt. We have Libya, Maldives, Ireland, Mexico, several countries. They all have formally filed to intervene in support of South Africa's case. And in February 2024, the ICJ issued provisional measures ordering Israel to take all measures to prevent the acts of genocide, to ensure humanitarian access to Gaza, and to preserve the evidence of crimes committed. However, although legally binding, the ICJ lacked an enforcement mechanism. And so Israel largely ignored these measures, continuing military operations and restricting aid. And so no serious international action was taken to enforce the court's rulings. Now, taking also a look at the universal jurisdiction efforts, how the concept of universal jurisdiction allows states to persecute individuals for war crimes committed elsewhere. We have seen several Palestinian victims and advocacy groups filing complaints in Spain, Belgium, and South Africa against Israeli leaders. However, these cases faced slow progress or bureaucratic obstacles, and even Spain's national court acknowledged reception of such cases, but it has not initiated any prosecutions as of April 2025. And so, for the same reason, political pressures and diplomatic sensitivities led many countries to avoid progressing on these cases. Now, this takes us to the academic concept of the Frankenstein problem in international relations and how institutions can act against their purpose. So to fully understand the structural failure that we're witnessing, it's crucial to introduce the concept of the Frankenstein problem. This term is derived from Mary Shelley's famous novel. It describes situations where institutions that were created to serve noble goals eventually become so distorted, politicized, or constrained that they undermine or even betray their original missions. So, like Frankenstein's creature, these organizations were intended to protect humanity, but now they often perpetuate the very injustices that they were meant to prevent. In the context of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, the United Nations was created after World War II with a core mission to prevent atrocities against civilians. Yet, in 2024 to 2025, and even before that, we've seen the UN Security Council completely paralyzed by repeated vetoes. The International Criminal Court was established to end impunity for war crimes, yet today the ICC faces unprecedented political threats from powerful Western states, warning it against issuing arrest warrants against Israeli leaders, along with the financial and political pressures it faces. UN humanitarian agencies, particularly the UNRWA, were created to provide basic life-saving support, yet countries like the UK, the US, and Germany defund such organization based on contested allegations. And thus the Frankenstein problem today is not a theoretical concept, it's a lived reality in Gaza and the West Bank. International institutions that were originally born to protect human rights are being mutated under geopolitical pressures into entities that often sustain, excuse, or even facilitate injustice. especially when the perpetrators are allies of powerful states. And unless reclaimed, such institutions will risk all credibility, allowing global humanitarian law to collapse into a selective, politicized enforcement. And so to restore integrity, we would recommend to insulate funding of UN bodies from political interference, to apply universal accountability, because, for example, if international law applies in Ukraine, it must apply in Gaza. We have to strengthen the ICJ and ICC mandates. We should amplify Palestinian civil society documentation in international fora, and we should build regional local coalitions to pressure international bodies to act impartially. And so to conclude, international organizations must decide either they reclaim their mandates with courage or they will become empty shells, complicit in the suffering they vow to prevent, because justice delayed is justice denied, and justice politicized is justice destroyed. Thank you very much.